So what this doesn't incorporate is like a carrying capacity argument, right? That says 200 years ago, you could have supported X number. That's a different exercise completely. What this does is, what's that?
It doesn't matter.
Well, you're right. But to answer your question, this can't set that sort of baseline. But what this does do is take the existing data and allows you to understand what the drivers are and how much of that is due to what Kerry referred to as common cause variation. This is something that normal fluctuations versus things that happen that are really special cases. And those are things that we can do something about, possibly. Right? Yeah.
Brian, and the reason I'm doing this is your first time in front of this group. We've only been at this for about 9 years, so we kind of it's better, I think, to have the conversation as we go than to wait to the end and then go back through the slides. So, Brian, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to ask, it would appear that what you're saying, you get something like the 200-year model, which you have June sucker for sagebrush. Yeah. And do we have a terrestrial worker model that we have some track record with?
Well, do we have an example of some other species?
Somewhere we had track record in this kind of approach.
Yeah, let me add something good. We ran that model out 200 years in the future, right? So we can do that 1,000 years, we can do that as long as you want, right? But what we don't have in June sucker is historic data on population size that you do have. So all of that whole model will be based on information from let counts or whatever it is over the past period of time. But of course, in the future, we can go as far as you want, but you can see from those graphs that becomes, if we model it as regular cyclic periodic variation, then that's how that model turns out, and you see that in those population fluctuations. The key from the second model here is what are the parameters that you have to focus on in order to get that trend to be stable or moving up slightly rather than being declining over that long period of time in the face of climate variation or other drivers that can be put in there.
But my question though relates to enforceability of the idea through track record, because that's what we hear from the Fish and Wildlife Service. Very much, I won't speak for you, but that's what we want to know is are we looking at this and saying this looks like it'd be a great idea and we'll be able to support this? Are we looking at this as something where we've used this amount of effort before and use it as a defensible mechanism to predict the futures based on our plan?
Sure, yeah. Oh, so I just returned from a workshop and a meeting in California where the focus was on this exact approach. And there are a host of species, terrestrial vertebrates and other things where this has been used. It is the go-to method, a reliable method. It's got a long track record in terms of being able to determine how populations grow, what are the sensitive parameters, and to be able to predict that. Now, any model is only as good as the data, right? And we'll get to that. But as far as the methodology, there's a good track record in terms of that. Yeah. Please.
Yeah.
Two quick questions. On sage-grouse, what would you anticipate the time frame being for constructing that life history? Are we talking from data that was collected in the 40s or really good data that was collected starting about 15 or 20 years?
Well, it would require first and foremost a literature search. See who among the researchers who are interested in sage-grouse biology have addressed some important issues like recruitment or juvenile survival. And there was a mention of paper that was done with using a matrix population model with this Colorado population. We wanted to investigate the kind of life history model they use for their species. Did they incorporate the same kinds of survivorship probabilities, and what were they? And where's the data that shows that? Well, that's the kind of effort that would be required. In the case of the June sucker, we supplemented what we could find in other species that were also suckers, looking at data that came from that life history model, and also a population of red butte area, I think it is called.
That was you guys.
So we can, you can incorporate, to build the model, you can incorporate data from whatever sources you have. And the better you are at getting that specific parameter value, that tells you how things are right now. But the advantage of this matrix population modeling is that you can use that then in a predictive sense, right? And what it will tell you when you get, if your numbers are reasonably close, it will tell you which of those parameters, with first year survival or whatever it is, are the most sensitive to affecting population growth. So you use this model in a predictive sense. So what we're not doing is modeling a specific population and saying, here's exactly what happens in that population, because there are a few examples where we have some data, but this is built to be a general model that can incorporate some of the variation that we think already exists in the data, but we can use that in a predictive sense to guide and help us make decisions about what are the trade-offs, what are the opportunities that we have to maintain a viable population in the face of whatever those drivers or effects are.
We're combining real data, survivorship data, with the ability to ask questions. What if scenarios, you see? And if we can alter those survivorship probabilities that we obtain from the literature, how would we do that? And if we could do that, here's the kind of results we could expect. That's the prediction.
Follow-up question on bullet number 3. What sort of data would you anticipate using to populate climate trends, environmental variation? Historical data or future modeling?
Yeah, it would be
Purely historical. Okay.
Sure.
Like the sucker that you mentioned, sage grouse, there's still a lot of things we don't know about it, a lot of sources of uncertainty. And it seems like those would end up going into the model, different ways you've just mentioned of trying to build the models. I'm just wondering, are there ways to quantify that uncertainty at different places in the model, just so we have an idea of what, yeah.
So from the first exercise that we talked about there is, as you can see, if you go back and look at historical climate data, for example, and it doesn't have to be just climate data, it can be, but typically that's what we have, right? And so what you're going to end up with is a model with a certain amount of variation explained, but there will still be this unexplained variation, right? But we can quantify that. And so we know how good our predictive capabilities are based on the sort of fit and the drivers that we identify there. So we can identify that level of uncertainty. That's well within the capabilities. But the other thing that the matrix population model allows us to do is to ask questions and say, what if another important driver is this? And this is the way it functions. What does that do to population growth? And so we can test, if you will, candidate other sources that we may not have data on, but at least we can get a ballpark estimate of how important could this be, right? How important could harvest be, or whatever it is. We can incorporate those and ask the question. And as it turns out, some of those, because of the life stages that they affect, are more or less important than other drivers. But we can get that in sort of a ballpark range and say, well, here's something that we've been concerned about, but there's no way in the model that this can have more than a 10% effect, or whatever it ends up being. We can quantify those things.
Let me add that as a general sort of principle, all models are lies.
Don't I know it?
It's just that some models are more effective than others and maybe less uncertain.
But I was just going to ask on the weather, how macro would that be if there were seasonal impacts on springtime and severe weather during that time? Will we be able to look at those impacts versus just annual results?
Well, in fact, that's probably where we ought to focus first, because we have this rich data set since 1949 on lek behavior. And so there are other factors in the life history of the annual cycle life history in biology of the critter, like winter over winter survival, for example, and improvement throughout the juveniles and falls, juvenile survival. But we But we have these data. Let's focus on what we have first that's rich and informative. And the spring examples of cycles and weather and climate issues would be the right place to look.
Let me make one point relative to that. In that initial model, you can put in variables that would span sort of this hierarchical range. Maybe it's part of the year, maybe it's the full year, maybe it's the 10-year trend, right? But all of those can be evaluated in that model to ask which of those have more predictive power or not. And we would certainly, when you're dealing with something like climate, you certainly want to use a range of variables, including means and variance over time. And that's all within the capabilities of that.
Let's start a couple more and then we'll move on. But go ahead.
I just wanted to ask where you're getting your climate data from. Are you downloading from DayMet or?
Well, in this particular case, we had a colleague of ours who was with the Central Utah Water Conservancy District, who was pointing us out for locations of data for lake levels in Utah Lake and the Provo River discharge, which is it's continuous. But I didn't have access to it. He was pointing to the locations where we could obtain that. And we're not sure yet exactly where to obtain that information from Salesforce, but I'm sure we can find something.
You may have spoken to this, but I didn't catch it if you did. The raw climatic or weather data is important, but in relationship to the plant species that the bird requires or habitat, effective precipitation is as important as anything. Is that reconciled somehow in this model or addressed?
Not in this particular model, matrix population model, but it's a good lead-in to the final model.
We're into the habitat part. Okay. All right. One last thing before you move, because I think this is really important. If we were to use this type of an analysis, my assumption is that once the model is built, the repeatability is built into it. So as we get new data every 3 years, every 5 years, you can update the model and make sure, is it correct? If it's incorrect, you can make those adjustments, and that's a relatively easy adjustment to make. Am I correct?
That's right. And the issue for liability only improves with
The more you do.
more data.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thank you.
All right, so in this particular list, the final model of the three that we want to discuss has to do with explanatory, this habitat explanatory. In this particular case, we can do something that statisticians have developed in the late 20th century, which is a multivariate concept. And the point being that you have multiple responses. And in this particular example, there are lots of avian species and others, mammals, for example, that are characteristic of the sage shrub steppe ecosystem. And so that matrix, as it were, or this particular vector is a vector of all of these variables, being each of the species in that ecosystem. And the multivariate X, or the regressor, predictor variables, all have to do with phytogeoclimate or habitat variables. Things like sagebrush percent cover, average sagebrush height, forb and grass cover, and in the case of soil percent sand, clay, organic matter, etc. And that's probably not an exhaustive list. So we have then multiple Y's, responses, and multiple X's, or regressors. Well, it turns out that there's a methodology in several kinds of models that you can use. One is what's called a multiple regression model. Again, that's probably from your statistics class. And the other, where you have a whole bunch of, you have one model for every single response, every single species. Or you use a methodology called principal consequence analysis, which takes all those Y's and summarizes them into a single most important response. Or this particular method, which is called partial least squares. And in the essence of this one that's powerful is that you're modeling the multivariate Y's as a function of the multivariate X's simultaneously. That's the key to that particular methodology. So what we did an example of the leatherside chub here on the northern slopes of the Uintas. We looked at 37 stream reaches, about 200 meters in length. By electrofishing counts, we get 13 species. There's our Y, right? And well, In this case, the Ys were calculated as 4 diversity responses and richness. So, and then we had X's, 18 of these aquatic and terrestrial habitat variables. So we had multivariate Y and multivariate X. And just to look at the correlations between the taxonomic richness and diversity and the functional richness and diversity of the ecological variables, they're highly correlated. But using this partial least squares regression model of fitting things simultaneously, we produce what's called a variable importance for projection, or VIP statistic summary. And the authors of this particular methodology suggest that values greater than 0.8 identify those X's, those regressor variables that are most important in explaining what's going on in the responses, all simultaneously. So in that particular case, this particular VIP plot, as it's called, shows that here are the top performers. Among all these 18 variables, there may be 5 or 6 that are really important to explaining the variability among all of those responses. Well, here are the coefficients of the regression equation that I specified right there, all those betas. And for each of these 4 response variables, they have very similar patterns. You would expect that given the fact that we saw the correlation matrix, they were all highly positively correlated. So this is what we expect. Now, in our case, with the sage-grouse, we have multiple species. I'm probably getting ahead of myself for this. Let's finish out the leatherside example. Here are the top 5 phytogeoclimate explanatory variables, meaning they explain most of what's going on in those 4 leatherside community diversity responses. So this came from the VIP plot. Managing leatherside community diversity then will be a focus on those variables from that VIP plot. And in the southern U.S. Well, let's talk about sage-grouse application. Here are a couple of hypotheses. There are multitudes we can generate. Some these may not be the most important to the community here at large who are concerned about sage-grouse numbers, but sage-grouse are in fact an umbrella species. I read that as a statement about the sage-grouse. I presume that means that what you do for sage-grouse can affect positively for other species in that same community that are under the umbrella. So we asked the question, are the same phytogeoclimate habitat variables that are most explanatory for sage-grouse equally explanatory for other biota in the ecosystem? That's a question based on this hypothesis. Second hypothesis, sage-grouse obligate, sagebrush obligate species within the ecosystem respond similarly to energy development footprints. So if it's deleterious to sage-grouse, is it in between the habitat suitability for sage-grouse in and outside of that range of our footprints from the energy development? Can we show that the lex with similar suitabilities near and excluded from well-drilling sites show similar density disparities among multiple community species? So there's a couple of hypotheses which we can address with this test method of partial least squares regression. We can provide evidence from the explanatory variable comparison, the VIP plots, and we can provide evidence also from the equally suitable habitats hypothesis for these specific kinds of hypotheses. Here's the thing, the habitat management practices for sage-grouse will derive from this particular VIP plot and the regressor coefficient subset that I illustrated with our leatherside chap. So how would we specifically, what would we do? Well, we would go out in the near term and we begin at selected core areas. And we census the number of these species in the avian community. Perhaps we look at these mammals also in that same community of sagebrush, throatstep. Now all of these, you see, are responses. They're multivariate Ys. And then we have a multivariate X's, all regressors that are based on sagebrush cover, etc. Same things we talked about before. So what would we do? We would model Ys the responses for all these species as a function of these X's in that simultaneous partial least squares regression equation. So we would compare the fit of sage grouse only versus X, and fit all other species in the community versus X, and compare that to the VIP plots that are the principal result from our partial least squares regression. And now we have, you see, as follow-up, we can explore population management practices based on these very important explanatory phytogeoclimate habitat variables. That's the nature. That allows us now powerful predictive tools to manage both the populations and the land management resources in order to help preserve this species from falling into the category of endangered species. So we've discussed 3 methods for extending our knowledge about sage-grouse biology. Predictive population model using climate data, the matrix population model that uses the what-if scenarios based on survivorship, and the habitat explanatory models from phytogeoclimate data. And I might mention, as a famous statistician, W. Edwards Deming once said, there is no substitute for knowledge. Deming, incidentally, is a native son of Wyoming, who was born in Cody.
It is always dangerous to quote a statistician, but because of his stellar genetic upbringing, we will allow that.
Nature or nurture dominated.
Correct. His environmental upbringing obviously made him a brilliant man.
Well, thank you for your time and consideration.
Kerry, thank you. A couple questions on this, and obviously one is the timeline. We don't have the luxury of years to do this. So what are you looking at as a reasonable timeline to complete the analysis? And the second question is what are we looking at cost-wise?
Well, it would be, in fact, a determination of which, these have sort of a sequential nature to them. And so the first thing to do would be to spend time and effort trying to determine the source of climate data that will allow us to give the predictive models first. And then we could explore the literature as we're doing that for data on survivorship probabilities for each of those life history stages. And then lastly, we have, it's the last model, you see, that is substituting space for time. We don't have, as you pointed out, we don't have time to go out and start measuring concomitantly or simultaneously the habitat variables at the same time we're measuring lead vectors. We need to do that, but we don't have that rich timeline worth of data like we do for lead since 1949. So we're going to substitute, we suggest substituting space for time here. Let's select some of those, maybe 30 to 40 of those core areas, and let's begin to send out a group of a cadre of researchers to measure these phytogeoclimate variable data. And we can do that within perhaps 2 to 3 seasons. And you need, 1 year does not make a reliable data set. Everybody does that. 3 to 5 years makes something that gives you some credibility and a sense that you're getting at some core issues or important issues. There's no substitute for data, just as Demi said. And that means something we begin now to think about what we should measure from now on, in addition to what we are measuring.
So the first 2 are data analysis. We don't have to do anything in the field. Those could be accomplished fairly quickly. That third one, what you get out is going to depend on what sort of data you put in. And so that's going to extend a bit longer.
But given where we are, the first 2 are the benchmark or the baseline that we would want. The rest, as we talked earlier, is something you would update continuously as you move forward. So I don't think that's an issue. Larry, did you have a question?
No, that's the way I look at it. The first 2 are based on existing data. So my assumption, you didn't give us a time frame. That could happen relatively.
That's sort of in the years. I mean, that's kind of in next year by this time you could have results from both those because they're not they're not dependent on a field season.
But if, let's say we decided we wanted to do that, and we added an extra 6-pack, we could probably have it by March, right?
Well, I'm afraid that, given that I'm a teetotaler, I don't think that's much incentive.
You pick some other Evanston on your way back. You gotta motivate something,
Yeah.
you know?
There are motivators, I suspect.
Okay, other questions? Yep, I can't see Matt, go ahead.
Just a real quick observation first. Taylor just published a matrix-based population growth paper using data from across the range of the species, your demographic information from across the range of the species. That was just published. Most of Wyoming's information went into that paper. Second thing is there's been several entities, USGS is the primary one, that have attempted to correlate left counts through time with environmental variables through time to try and get a handle on the simplicity or cyclicity of the cycle. And that those efforts have been unsuccessful. The correlation between our more consistently collected environmental variables and let counts across the range of the species there's not a good correlation. And then the third is a question. When you started the initial model, the interesting aspect of that is the time component. We're looking at changes in populations through time and how those relate to changes in your environment through time. Then your matrix-based aspect of that is a point-in-time modeling exercise. You don't incorporate temporal variability into that modeling framework. And the issue that I see there is that during times of hard environmental conditions, let's say, populations are declining, what probably pulls those populations up is your adult survival. Your adult survival is probably your most sensitive demographic during those times, whereas when those populations are increasing, your most sensitive demographic is probably some of your productivity demographics. So the time varying aspect of your initial model is important in your second model as well. If you're going to try and tie those two modeling efforts together into a projection of population growth in time, and I'm wondering how you varying aspect in your vital rates and add that. Is that a component of what you want to try and do?
It is, and if you go back to that progression, we model and try to get a handle on exactly those sorts of dynamics, and then that is incorporated into the population projection matrix. So what we're not doing is just what's been published already to say, here's a new model that's a static model that says, here are the vital rates no matter what. But we can take that environmental data and incorporate that into the population projection matrix model, so that what you get is an estimation of what is happening to those vital rates through time. Those vary through time based on the climate or the other things that are going on there, and that's what creates this variation that you see in those population projections, right? That's all based on the expectation that climate and those other things will vary, and understanding this idea of, well, here's what carries us through, what causes populations to increase, here's what causes populations to decrease. That's all incorporated in that model. So you don't just get a straight line, a single lambda out there. You get a climate-based projection of what those populations could be like. And really the value here is not saying in 2026 we will have X number of sage grouse. That's not the strength of this model. What the strength is to say, here are the factors, here are the vital rates that are most sensitive through time that will respond to the climate or other things. So that is in fact incorporated in that second model.
Okay, we're over time. One repeat, and then if you want to visit on the break, you can do it.
wanted to quickly say, I'm not sure how great grip we have on those habitat explanatory factors. And it seems like those are critical decisions. What data needs to be collected, what should be looked at in there.
That would be part of the research effort, would be to collect and determine. There's lots of literature about what sagebrush require in terms of the density, the species, the height of the sagebrush, the percent cover that's pertinent to winter survival, perhaps more than is the actual lek itself. But nonetheless, looking at the leks and where the highest densities and core leks are, do we have any measurements at all? And I'd ask that question, and we don't have any data on the habitats, at least that I had access to. I had lek numbers. The obvious is to measure the number of birds, males and females you see in the leks. But in terms of concomitant measurements about the lek itself and the phytogeoclimatic variables, this wasn't there. So that's what we would project would be an effort for that third kind of modeling, was to what we could go out and collect and then show in a comparison of space the important variables that appear to be associated with high and low lek numbers.
Let me see one quick addition to that. In addition to the variables that predict something going on with sage grouse, the other thing that Terry presented is we will collect data on other co-occurring species, because it becomes important whether you're talking about species that respond independently or species that respond as a group. And that's, we think that's probably the case, but if you have data on both sides of that equation, right, the species responses and the predictor variables, the climate or habitat variables in this case, both of those things are simultaneously evaluated and allow us to determine how that community responds. So you're right, we don't have a lot of that information, but that's something that we can get through data collection.
Thank you very much.
Did I miss the answer, one of the answers?
We all know.
Questions?
They won't lose before we do this. Okay. In the spirit of Christmas future, we have Nick and Nicholas. So who's gonna, Nicholas, you gonna start out or Nick? Okay, thanks, Nick.
So appreciate everyone's time today. We're going to be talking about a concept that Anadarko has developed and are looking to kind of push forward through PAW called the Sage Grouse Habitat Mitigation Opportunity Mapping Tool, affectionately referred to as the MOM tool. Sounds nice, right? So, you know, this concept we've taken to a number of different folks all across the country, really. We've been out in DC, presented to Gary Frazier, he had a lot of interest in it. This was also presented to Noreen Walsh. She had a lot of interest. We went out to Portland, talked to Shauna Ginger. She also had a lot of interest. This is kind of bare bones. There's a lot of stuff that still needs to go into this, but we think it's something worthwhile we want to bring to the table and really kind of vet out the interest from the group and maybe buy-in. So, an overview, this is really not required by the EO, it's supplemental to the EO, and seeking by no means any exception to any of the EO requirements. The tool itself allows for the tracking of disturbance, reclamation, and mitigation activities on an integrated level across the state of Wyoming. We think the tool may be one of several methods to track the success of the core area policy. And one of the big things, at least from an industry perspective here, potential mitigation efforts could be generated by non-core, should underline that and put it in bold, non-core timing stipulation relief. And mitigation efforts would address existing disturbance and fragmentation within close proximity to leks. So a number of folks have seen this map. This was actually just published a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, I guess, in Human Wildlife Interactions. We had a paper that got published there. So this is looking at every lek, whether it's occupied or unoccupied, across the state of Wyoming. It's a combination well information from the Wyoming Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. So we really think this is kind of a science-based approach, at least looking at these areas in close proximity to lakes. So this references some work that was done by Doherty et al. In 2010, and his analysis showed that if you had less than or equal to 12 wells within a 2-mile buffer surrounding a lake, impacts from oil and gas infrastructure were thought to be indiscernible. So the green lakes are lakes which would fit that benchmark, and that encompasses about 75% of lakes within the state of Wyoming. If you had greater than 60 wells within that 2-mile buffer, the chances were more likely than not you were going to have pretty discernible impacts to the lake and risk like abandonment. When you look at that across the state, of course, those kind of pop up in the areas where you would expect them to, where you have significant oil and gas development, such as up in the Powder River Basin, up in northeastern Wyoming. And so when you look at that map, this is where all a lot of the red dots are. Hess and Beck also in 2012 had a paper out looking at the 1 kilometer buffer around the lake, 0.6 miles. We found if you had 3 oil and gas wells, chances of lake abandonment were higher than the chances of that lake persisting. So there's a lot of science out there looking at these kind of close buffers, and so this concept, this 2-mile buffer concept that we're going to put forward here, is really tied into those particular papers. So ultimately what we're hoping to create is kind of a statewide database of these 2-mile buffers, where you have a lek shown here in the center, lek data below the actual map that would hopefully show, as you focus reclamation and mitigation efforts within these buffers, increases within that lek number over time. And then a number of other detail sources such as active oil and gas wells, disturbance, land ownership, etc. What's interesting about this particular lek, I don't exactly remember where this was at. It's in the Rollins field office, but here you've got almost 9% surface disturbance within that 2-mile buffer, and you've got a pretty robust population that's increasing over time. So I'll let Nicholas talk about the methodology here.
So, so where I come into this is we were approached, we at the university at Install and some other people there, Anadarko and some other people from KW came to us and they said, hey, we have this good tool, but we don't want it to be industry's tool. So we want this to be science-based. So they came to us and we said, you know, we like the science about it, and we don't want to produce something that's, you know, an industry tool. We wanted to produce something that was useful for the sage grouse community, and kind of strip the stigma of an industry tool away from it. So we got together and we agreed with the concept, and we thought, you know, this fits in with some of our existing framework. So we have lek data already. We have the counts. We have land ownership, all of that stuff. And so, you know, we got together and we came up with some ways that we could implement this. The first thing was kind of a phase design. So looking at the phases, the first thing we need is we need the data, right? So we have an ongoing project, you know, looking at digitizing all of the disturbance within query. So what we did is we said, okay, well, what would it take to expand that to be within 2 miles of all of the lakes? And so we proposed that as phase 1A. Phase 1B, which you'll probably hear some more about from Mike Curran this afternoon, is looking at the reclamation piece and trying to, you know, contemplate how we can then tie that reclamation into our statewide existing disturbance. Mike and I have kind of brainstormed. We don't have a perfect solution, but we have something that we're ready to test at least. So, you know, phase 1A and phase 1B is data collection for this. Phase 2 is actually building a web interface that would allow you to do a similar thing to this map produced, but maybe you can select the LEC and you know, decide what you want to look at with that LEC. We're still basing it on that 2-mile buffer because that's what our data is based on. But developing a web application that would allow you to basically then analyze the data from phase 1.
With the outcome of that being a prioritization of where to do work.
Exactly, and you could, and this is where, you know, we're trying to make sure that we're in with the science. What the university and our group has proposed is develop this web app. How that's implemented will be up to groups like this and understanding that sort of stuff. Providing the data is the data. So, so we feel that fits in well. Right now, phase 2 and phase 3 are loosely defined because they're in the future. So there's definitely opportunities to steer those. Phase 1A and B are basically an expansion of work that's going on already.
Timeline?
I think I figured it would add 48 weeks to once we started phase 1A to expand that area.
Extra 6 back, we're down to 36 weeks.
Well, we've got 3 of the people here that will be working on that. So 3 extra 6 packs.
All right. Hostage negotiation. I'll tell you.
I mean, they're starting over there.
All right, make it an even cake. Each get a 6 pack.
And so, and then I'll turn it back over to him. Stop working. So this is just a visual example of kind of how it expanded. So we have a LEC, we would look outside of core. We have our DDCT, we have reclamation like database and all that stuff playing nice together. So
The hope is that all this, you know, all these different efforts talk to each other at the end of the day. We can derive value from understanding kind of holistically the big picture of what's going on in the landscape. So just in summary, you know, we think this complements existing reclamation tracking and builds on the existing DVC database. I think this also maybe fits in with the ISMs or the spraying application database that BLM has. This fits in easily with WIDIS existing framework, cost effective, can put together rather quickly, incentivizes industry to reduce its disturbance footprints, creates a simple mapping tool to monitor and track disturbance on a statewide basis, provides our high-level identification of LEC-centric offsite mitigation locations, creating approximately 2,500 opportunity areas across multiple land ownerships over 31,000 square miles of important sage-grouse habitat. One of the best things that it provides a tracking mechanism for mitigation efforts, both on-site and off-site. Again, this is industry-developed approach to monitoring, and establishes monitoring of impacts and restoration applicable to future threats of other sage steppe obligate species. So I think this has an application much broader than sage-grouse in the future. And most importantly, we've among about 8 or so different companies, we've got the first $102,000 in the bank and ready to go for kind of kicking this first phase of the project off. Right. So
When did you start this?
As I say, this looks very familiar, except it's times 20.
Yeah. No, I think given where we started a year and a half ago, to see where we've come to is truly inspiring. And you have a question, Eric?
A question regarding the 2-mile buffer versus the DDCP area. 2-mile buffer is 12.5 square miles. I've seen DDCPs that are 229 square miles. Are you going to be looking at those scales? Is it going to be based on, you know, the LEC is a
5% choice for DECTs, or, you know, how you work that out?
So this effort is specifically looking at just the 2 mile buffer. You know, the DDC process is its own animal, and they're still very separate. They just talk together and keep track of the disturbance on the landscape through this tool, as well as a number of other things.
I think let me ask it more directly. Is it scalable?
Is it scalable? Yeah, I'm sure it could be.
It could, can I address that a little bit? I did initially think, hey, let's try to spec this out at a 4 mile buffer just to see what it would take. And that 102 went to about 170.
Yeah.
Just because it adds a huge amount of space. So, basically just adding the 2 miles is almost doing core over again. So it is scalable. It's just we would need the data to do it.
And I would say that, you know, when you look at the mosaic of leks across the landscape, I mean, the picture I showed earlier has one lek, but there's 2 other leks that are also kind of on the periphery of that lek. And so a number of these kind of, you know, touch and expand out. So the 2 mile buffer encompasses a considerable land mass.
And I guess where I'm going with that is that there's never been a study that looks at what the threshold of development is on a DDCT scale that causes sage grouse populations to decline. And in the absence of such studies looking at that variable, it's hard to defend the DDCT as being scientifically based, because there are no studies that actually have ever looked at what the threshold would be if you calculate the land area for well density or for disturbance density on that DDCT area. So it would be an added value of the study.
The DSCT does also calculate the density and disturbance on a black-by-black basis. That was part of the reported with the DSCT as well. It is a 4 month buffer. So it does report both the overall issues that it does, so it breaks it out black-by-black. So there is that aspect of it. But this would also be, this is purely lek-centric, and it's would be statewide, so it would definitely be something.
Yeah, and I think you answered your question, Nick, well, and that is, if you do it at 2, that gives you a scalability to look at what have you missed, which is probably going to be external edges, because in a lot of cases, the 2 will fill itself in. And so, you know, given the cost, I think that's somebody over here had a question.
I think it would be worthy of study to see what land mass we do miss with the 2 mile left by left, just to see where we are. And my understanding is a lot of this is emphasizing non-core habitat.
So, you know, ultimately, I think where we'd like to get is non-core timing stipulation for mitigation.
Or having done this throughout.
Well, so this would be
It's similar to what we talked about in the Buffalo.
Not be sure where we are.
Okay, other thoughts? I mean, I think what basically, from an information perspective, they wanted to share this, but certainly they're not asking for money. I think if anything, they're asking us for thoughts, and my thought, and I see a lot of heads nodding, is get after it. We'll find the beer in the budget. Just get going. And is that pretty reflective of everybody's thoughts?
I have a question first.
Yeah.
On the methodology part, you're talking about disturbances within 2 miles of the lek. You have agriculture listed, so what is ag disturbance?
We would use the same methodology that we use for defining ECT disturbance. It would be the same data set. All we would be doing is scanning it. So it would still be converting anthropogenic disturbance, so anything that converted sagebrush to or suitable habitat to some sort of other use. Now we would still apply the 275 meter buffer. We would still apply the 60 meter buffer for second pickets and all the other stuff that we do with DECT. It would just, all we're doing is expanding that data set to include some additional stuff outside of core.
The conversion would be to unsuitable habitat. So if it was converted to alfalfa on the edge of a sagebrush field, that would count as suitable. If it's wheat, it doesn't. Yeah.
And yeah, we can still apply these buffers and all the same practices we do now.
What I was trying to get to actually was that we maintain the definitions throughout as used in the DCT, as used in the EO, so that we can directly interpret That's where I'd really like us to come back when we do this sort of thing, so that we don't have to translate. between-
That's part of the benefit of bringing widest in is it is the same data set. And it would be the same, crew looking at board versus this expanded area. So it would be, we would have the same standards. And consistency.
Esther, anything you want to add from PAW side?
No.
Okay, well, guys, carry on. Thank you. We're gonna take a break now because I want everybody to be full of piss and vinegar when we get to the next topic. So, let's take, 10 minutes, be back at 10:30.
Take care. Yeah, go. Yeah. All right, grab your seats. Let's get going.
No. Well, let's see what happens.
Okay, we're back on schedule. We're actually slightly ahead, which doesn't mean we can't veer off the tracks again. I was asked to attend, Jeremiah and I was at a meeting last week of the Federal Natural Resource Policy Select Committee of the Legislature. And I got a call and asked to come up and sit in and listen to a conversation, which started at their meeting in Casper a month ago. And I'm not going to paraphrase the meeting because Senator Hicks is a member of that, who was at that meeting as well. But in general terms, a couple of topics came up. One, this apparently it's a cyclic thing like sage grouse. About every 3 years, we talk about sage grouse zoos. And that was quite a lengthy discussion. It careened on and off the tracks for quite some time. And there was a good point raised in there by Larry, and that was, we think we have a pretty good idea that you can trap and move birds into areas where you have exceeded populations. There's no evidence that we have that you can raise them. And my greater concern at that meeting was, what are you going to do with them? I mean, we're in many cases at carrying capacity. We may even be at places where we exceed it. So if you can raise them, which hasn't been shown to be possible, what are you going to do with them when you're done? So Larry, why don't you kind of frame this up, and then we'll see where we want to go with it. But I'll let you kind of explain it, since it did come from the Senate side.
It wasn't the senator, though.
And I will clarify that repeatedly. Yeah.
I think there's interest in trying to solve the sage grouse issue. One of the things that I suggested the committee may want to look at, rather than a captive breeding program, is complete with wildlife conservation biology, that we've often supplemented populations with wild captures and wild transfers. Probably the most successful one that I would point to here in the state of Wyoming recently would be wolf range. So there's a whole host of issues to deal with. We do it repeatedly with turkeys, wild sheep, so we've got a avian population. So what I had suggested that from a legislative standpoint, rather than focus on looking at a captive breeding program, is we start to refine those questions on how we successfully would deal with transfer or supplemental populations of sage grouse. Where we clearly in Wyoming, we hunt the bird, so we have a surplus population. So we identify those source-sink type relationships when we have a strong population, and then transfer or translocate some of those birds where we may have a declining population. Some of the issues that would have to be answered is, do you use migratory birds on top of non-migratory birds? What's the time of year that's best conducive for trapping birds? Do soft releases, hard releases. The idea there is some preliminary information, and it may be another conservation tool out there that hasn't been evaluated extensively at this point in time. So that was a discussion. I think it had some support from the legislature to the point that we also talked about there's additional needs to do some supplemental appropriations or additional appropriation to look at it. It's something that the legislature would certainly be receptive to doing, given the fact it's something we could do right away. Obviously, it's going to entail a research component associated with that, other than just catching and turning those birds into a series of questions that need to be asked. But clearly what we want to do, I think, from the legislative side of this committee is look at this as another conservation tool for sage grouse, because we do have surplus workers. We would be hurt copying in some places. But with that, Bob, I don't know what else you wanted to say.
So I think that gives an overview, and one thing we're fortunate, Lee, you did this with Gunnison, I believe. And you want to come up and give us kind of a background on what you found there and you know, some of the potential pitfalls with all that? Sure. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, actually, we did egg theft and captive rearing of chicks with greater sage grouse to release those in northwest Colorado. And then we did a captive breeding, everything from propagating the captive flock, breeding in captivity, brood rearing in captivity, releasing chicks at ages from 7 days to 7 weeks and monitored survival. And the short version is, it doesn't work very well. Currently,
The long version is they all died, right?
yeah, I mean, so there are different aspects that work really well. I mean, you can propagate a flock in captivity, and they will breed. Males will display. They will lay eggs. They will incubate. They will raise broods in captivity. But it is incredibly difficult. It is resource hungry. It is logistically trying. And then when you're actually rearing the chicks to release them into the wild, the key thing is getting those chicks, those captive reared chicks, assimilated to the wild as soon as possible. So your introductions typically have to occur within the first 7 days. So the adoption of the wild female will adopt the captive reared chicks. Well, now you've got a whole other logistical problem, and that there is a carrying capacity within the brood. Typically, most females can take 10 chicks at most. So now you're walking out there with 4, and she's only got room for 2. You take the other 2 back home with you. And they actually, the survival rates, this was for Gunnison, the survival rates into the fall weren't that much lower. Wild reared chicks survived, wild chicks marked in non-augmented broods. They had about an 8% survival into the fall population, plus or minus 2. And captive reared chicks had about 2% survival. So you can improve, and all things relative, it could be used, but the circumstances, I mean, it would have to be a case-by-case situation, and I would argue that it would have to be hand in hand with intensive other conservation actions, habitat improvements, other things, because it's not a silver bullet. You're just spending money, and if they're not being recruited into the breeding population, it's at a loss.
Kermit, do you have any thoughts from the legislative side?
No.
The other issues that I think that are out there, and really what I'm trying to do is get the issues laid on the table here. Aside from cost, aside from can you do it or not, is the issue of why would you? You know, a captive breeding program, the ones that I've been familiar with, were done as a last ditch effort to conserve or gather a species and build a population enough that you could actually return it. There's a question about, is this a potential disease vector? Is this a potential genetic issue? And I think all of those things could play into it. Obviously, in a 5-minute or 8-minute presentation to a legislative committee, we could spend the entire time on any one of those issues. With all due respect to our legislature, when you have as much to deal with as they do, you don't have the attention span to get into the detail that's required to analyze this issue. And it's one of those things that's on its face, kind of makes sense until you actually get down into it. But I think we owe it to them to at least have an honest assessment of both. And I know that there was one done by the department. I'd just like to take that as a starting point and expand on it. My suggestion would be that we have a subgroup, as we've done most of the things we do here, that starts to analyze that. The importance of this, and I'll understate it a bit, and I compliment Senator Anderson in particular for saying, we have a team that does this. We don't need a bill in the legislature to do this. We've got a group does this kind of work, and that's who should do it, and that's why it's on the table here today. And Senator Anderson from Glenrock was the one who brought that up, and I appreciate that very much, because trying to deal with a legislative bill in the scientific arena at times gets very, very messy. So I think if you're agreeable to that, I've got a group that I'd like to ask to head that up, and then we'll take a few minutes and just kind of give them bullet points. Larry, I want you to chair it if you would, please, because I think we need to have that linked back to the legislature. Pat and Leaf, if you don't mind working with her on that from the service side. I had Tom Christensen down, Bob, but it may be that it's easier for you to do it from here, but between the two of you for the department, could you please participate in that? Joe, Department of Ag, I think we need, because there is another extension of this into the, what if we have private game farms doing it? I think that becomes partially game and fish, partially agriculture, so you or someone from your department. Bruce Lawson, I know you've got a lot of experience in this, and I want, if you don't mind representing industry on that team. And Esther, could you, is she back there still? Would you serve as a member from oil and gas side? Okay, and then Brian, our favorite zookeeper, would you like to? Okay, is that, I think that's a fair group, and I think it's broad-based enough, and it has a lot of good experiential base to do this. So is everybody comfortable with that as an approach as to how to tackle this? Are there things that you want to raise that we didn't in the brief conversation leading up to it? Go ahead, Brian.
The only thing I would ask is that in these discussions, we know the limiting factor, as you stated earlier, with us being at carrying capacity, the limiting factor is habitat quality. So if the legislature can consider something that is a little less direct than the production of birds for release, I would suggest that we consider reviewing and researching how we go about returning some of the carrying capacity that this landscape has. And that is the simple, easiest way that you're going to see lift in these populations and offer that opportunity by having the carrying capacity go up, and therefore those populations rise on their own rather than through what in my experience is very risky operations of reintroduction.
Yeah, and you have free latitude as a group to make the recommendations you feel are appropriate. However, I would caution you that I do not want this to degrade back into the perpetual argument that it's all about habitat, when, yeah, that is a piece of it. I want the question answered first.
I'm actually saying this is separate from that consideration.
Yeah, and I think
that's the simplistic way I would put it, is if we've got time to consider something right now that we need for restoration on sage grouse, it's the capacity and knowledge for doing the understory returns and so forth that we need to see lift in the population.
And concurrent with what Nick and Nicholas have just presented, I think these two march right side by side, so that works well. Larry, you had something? Doug. Doug has been selected actually as the chicken ranch for Wyoming, his place up there in Fremont County. So we have the release site already identified. But go ahead.
Watch out for those breech eggs.
If the world will leave me alone, I'll raise chickens. Okay.
Not like them.
The kind we're talking about.
Okay.
I was trying to put myself in the position of being asked to support these two strategies. The first question I would have is, if you don't do these, explain to me biologically how our conservation efforts are going to allow for the expansion of the, that's got to be a component of this picture. Is if we don't do these things, we're doing these conservation measures, and it's kind of linking back to what Brian said, is, you know, how are they going to expand? You know, if they're on a downward trend, then we're going to hold them, I mean, get the bleeding stopped, as they say. How are they going to expand under what we're doing? That's got to be out there. Otherwise, people are going to keep asking, well, then let's do this.
since that doesn't seem to work. So that's one picture I would hope we could come up. I think it's there, but it has to be part of that presentation.
That's a good point. Great. Other thoughts?
You know, Bob, just one thing that comes to my mind, this was introduced by one of the gas operators who would frankly like the executive order to go away. And my caution to the group is this should not be an expectation that we're going to degrade other conservation efforts that we're doing. This would simply be the opposite of what we're doing. Supplement really.
Good point. Okay, yeah, Barry.
Yeah, on that note, I guess in the discussions I've had with some of this is looking at a short-term, long-term solution. I think it gets back to exactly what Doug was talking about. You know, oil and gas is temporal on the landscape. At some point in time, whether we've seen in the Powder River Basin with the decline in the coal bed meth industry, and now the reversion of a lot of those stockpiles, West Nile virus, while we're seeing a resurrection at certain points. We don't develop the research and the techniques now to be able to move birds. Let's talk about the Great Basin, a couple million acres of sheepgrass. You know, we're looking at some potential revolutionary things with science to be able to start to deal with declining sheepgrass. We also ought to be concurrently moving forward with how to develop those techniques and science to then move birds, because we very well could be in a point that 20 years from now, that we're going to need to supplement populations of birds in Nevada from Wyoming, or even from Wyoming within Wyoming, as we see oil and gas industry decline and that disturbance on the landscape. So I look at this not as a supplant the latest conservation tool in habitat, but to start to develop the techniques to be able to shepherd sagebrush in the next decade, and the next decade, and the next decade. The simple fact is, initially said, and I'm not talking about the captive breeding side of it as much as I am talking about capturing live birds. It's been a successful tool used for a multitude of species. Like I said, we've got wolves, turkeys, elk, all over North America. So, you know, it's developing those techniques and the ability now to answer those questions if and when this tool ever gets needed to have answers to the question. So, my vision of this is not to come out and say, we're just going to not do anything else. We're just going to raise a gunny sack full of birds and go turn them loose and then say we've done everything. That's not the intent. I don't think that was
that is
the
not
direction that I don't want to leave anybody with the discussion that happened at the Federal Natural Resource Committee. That's not what the intent of that discussion that happened at that committee. So.
Well, I think the underlying, thank you for that. I think the underlying intent was a what if. What if we get to a critical point and, you know, are we better to try and learn what we can today? I would agree that yes, that's the case. That doesn't mean that we're going to allocate millions of dollars to start growing birds we can't do anything with. Doesn't mean we might do some pilots. I think, again, your group has latitude. Make recommendations, come back to this group, let us know what you think, and we'll move forward. This won't be a one iteration deal. It'll probably be several. Tom?
Just as a follow-up to that, Larry, even though we haven't done a lot of movement of birds in this state, there has been in other states. And so some of that will just be simply reporting on what has gone. What there is a learning curve that has been already achieved. We hear about how it doesn't work, but when you look at the whole picture, yeah, there's not a good track record. But if you look at recent years, it's a much improved track record. So a lot of that learning has happened, not that it was done. So some of that's just going to be reporting on what's gone on, what we do know. And just so you know, you may be hearing about a request from a neighbor for grouse. And it will be interesting to see what the response of the state and the local places where those birds may come from. You know, so we'll learn about this, and it'll be more of an opportunity. But at some point, somebody's going to have to be willing to give up their birds for it to happen. So.
Well, we found out where we can get the beer for Nicholas's crew, I guess. Yes.
We heard recently of about the difficulties with the captive raised sage-grouse chicks, greater sage-grouse chicks, but that's only part of a long line of transplant efforts. I think I read one synopsis that indicated there were 79 different efforts at transplanting sage-grouse and that none of them were very successful. And so if the legislature is looking to spend money to improve sage-grouse populations, one of the things that they might be looking at is spending money on removing barbed wire fences that are causes of sage-grouse mortality, spending money on burial of overhead transmission lines that are causing sage-grouse to avoid the otherwise suitable habitats on either side. That might get you a bump in populations of the wild birds that far outweighs the possibility of trying to take captive or transplanted birds and put them out there and on range that otherwise might have habitat issues that prevent or restrict the ability of the birds to thrive.
Eric, I don't think anyone disagrees with that. However, that's outside the scope of what I've asked this group to do, and it is something that we're looking at. I mean, you could consider it, but I don't want to see you come back with a report that's light and fluffy on the questions that you were asked to address and then go off into 100 tangents. The other thing I would say is they have not been unilaterally unsuccessful. The strawberry population in Utah was recovered almost exclusively because of release of birds into populations that were diminished, and there are others, or at least one more in Utah, and I believe one in Colorado, where it's been shown to work. So let's not just automatically say it won't work. I want a good, fair analysis of what is out there. So that much said, let's move on. And yeah, go ahead.
Another quick
Sure.
On these reintroduction or farming or type things like that, is there any, I guess when I kind of live right in the middle of them there, you see them show up in different spots and there's habitats that they can link out and they'll move into and go back. The reintroduction seems almost more like a laboratory experiment than doing something right in the middle of the habitat. And I don't know if that's a factor. It'd be interesting to know, we were facetiously talking about game farms, but if you're right there in the middle of them and you could like turn out your back gate on familiar habitat, maybe there's a better chance. I think it's pretty iffy, but
I think you talked yourself right onto this.
No, I don't want to. No, I'll lobby my favorite subcommittee guy the next few days.
All right. Did you have something else, Brad?
I was just, this could be very extensive, but I think that it's important. First thing we're going to need from staff is going to be a literature search on what's out there so that we have the data in front of us when we start consideration.
Well, actually, the first thing we're going to need from you is a list of what you need and a cost associated.
I'm not the chairman. Suggest things.
You might catch him on the break. Okay. All right. Let's move on. Mary.
All right. Yeah, we just did a couple of items. So,
What minutes does it take to dim the lights?
hey, Bob. All right, so there's a lot of words up here, but I'm going to kind of screen through them. What I wanted to do, what I was asked to do, was to talk about the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service data call for the states. It was due on October 31st, although they still are taking data part of it. And they still have the conservation efforts database going on, and that closes 12/31/14.
And before she starts, I would like to let you know that Mary and her team did a Herculean effort to get this stuff done. It is impressive. It was a lot of work in a very short amount of time. And once again, when people say, why are we confident in Wyoming? It's because we have people like Mary and her group, and hats off to you. Tremendous job.
And it took a lot of people inside and outside. It's not just, it's the state of Wyoming.
You get all the bad credit, you get the good credit.
I did receive some of that too.
You invented all this DDCP.
All right, so this this was issued in August. We tried to collect the data. We have a web application that our IT folks built and Nicholas helped, and there was a lot of other people that were involved in that. Tom Christensen took a lot of the bullets here, population status and trends, hunting and other uses, disease and predation, other factors. So what we really wanted to do was provide, this is what we were asked to do, is the habitat status and trends and the sagebrush loss due to conversion, energy developments, fire, blah, 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 all these things. So putting that all together, and how do you tell the story? Because we wanted to tell our story, which is a fairly good story. We wanted to talk about how the executive order is proceeding, how it works, how it doesn't work, how we changed it, how we've adaptively managed it, all those types of things. So in the conversations leading up to the data call and leading up to 2015, Maureen from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Denver has said that they are going to consistently look at the conservation objective team report, look at 5 factors for listing, and then also look at the peace policy, the policy for the evaluation of conservation efforts. So we wanted to make sure that our data, Wyoming's data, was filtered against these. And I'm going to go through them. They're lengthy, but I've kind of boiled it down into some simple bullets. So the COT report. The COT report. So the COT report really has a couple of bullets, and we took these very seriously. It was stop bleeding, stop the population declines and habitat loss, implement targeted habitat management and restoration, develop and implement state and federal sage-grouse conservation strategies, develop and implement proactive voluntary conservation actions, develop and implement monitoring plans. And that was a biggie that Dave Brown and DAW that kind of got caught in the last data call. We took that very seriously and wanted to make sure that we follow up on all the conservation efforts if they're not fully effective. And then prioritize, fund, and implement research to address existing uncertainties. And we continue to talk about that even today. The 5 factors for the listing decision, these were shown in the 2010, and I mean, that was a lengthy document that Pat and her folks put together. And basically where we came in is the regulatory mechanism, inadequacy of existing protection. The peace policy, there's about 15 different things out there that they look at, and that what they're trying to do is say, okay, if you have plans or you have started conservation efforts but they're not completed, how does the service look at them for effectiveness in protecting bird? And to me, the peace policy boiled down is the project's planned or in process have a likelihood of actually providing the intended benefits. So we looked at our conservation actions as well through that same lens. So, you know, what our goal, and I hope this represents your thoughts, is we wanted to know and share what the SGO implementation looks like, and we wanted to make sure we told our story, because our story has gone on for a long time. So existing data, there was, I guess I don't know, I'm trying to say it positively. We don't have all the data yet. So the feds have some of the data, we have some of the data, and there were still question marks out there to receive the data. But we took what data we could get, and we tried to do the analysis. And I was just talking to Dave with Thunder Basin Grassland, trying to get his data. He's got 60 projects out there that we don't have in our database that I'd like to enter as well.
Unfortunately, Fish and Wildlife Service does, but they don't talk back the other direction.
Okay.
So we're trying to work around that.
We're whispering behind the scenes.
But the RCS, ordinary, is that data not in?
It's not into ours, no. It's not, I don't know what you guys are doing. I don't know what you guys are doing with the feds.
Yeah, we have a separate agreement with the service, our stuff due by the end of the year, and this one just ended, so, I think we're hoping to have it in by the end of December, to file in a similar format by basically forward measures.
And we're hoping to get that data, but we don't know yet.
Can we put, here today to talk about that a little bit more later, because I think that's a planning piece.
So, two things. The Toboggan data, we can share it from the CED into Wyoming's database. It's just a timing issue. But yeah, we can share that. There's just steps.
It's gonna be in January.
Yeah.
It's gonna be in January, and there's something we want to do.
Okay. In terms of NRCS, currently, NRCS and Sagebrush Initiative are compiling all the information related to sagebrush conservation efforts, and they'll be providing that to the service, summarized to protect private landowner information. So, as last I heard, we're supposed to get that by the end of the year as well. And then, assuming we'll have to follow that same sort of, yeah, we'll share it and figure out how to make sure we're getting that information back to you guys' database.
So we're trying to upload all our data to the conservation, so they'll have everything. We're trying to crosswalk and Douglas, Nicholas for doing that. He and Tom Graham are working on that crosswalk. But then in return, there's a lot of data that's being put in that we want to get back.
So is the CCAA data coming in, or is that also included in the federal?
Yes. We have it in ours and it's going to be uploaded to theirs. I don't know if
They have it also.
So Mary, we had all good intentions of getting our stuff in by October, it just didn't happen, but we're still shooting for end of the year for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. You still want?
Yes.
Yes.
Our stuff.
Yes. Because you'll see why. Because what we're trying to do is do a court. You'll see why. So, I mean, as the team and everybody who's worked on it, and there's probably been about 25 people who've worked on it. Jenny's been part of this. You know, we have a pretty solid running history of adaptive management, history of implementation, incredible knowledge of the bird locations, thanks to Tom and all the local working groups and industry. And then I called it vigorous. I mean, I was really impressed with the amount of conservation that's taking place, both in and out of core and state, on federal and on private lands. Okay, so the second piece, or the first piece was population trends, and Tom Christensen had gone through and talked about all the different pieces of it. You know, and all the charts, we laid all that information inside of that. Tom, do you want to say anything special about the population data?
You're doing fine.
Okay. So then we talked about habitat trends, because one of the things that I believe the service is doing is they're going to be looking at the models. They're going to try to look at the debits using land fire and some other different techniques. But we wanted to know how we were doing core area by core area, where the hotspots are, or whatever, you know. So we looked at the analysis. This is the PAD objective, two PAD objectives that looks at habitat loss. Is that you want to stop the population declines and habitat loss and develop and implement state and federal sagebrush conservation. Now, I know you can see this.
Hold on.
Yeah.
I want to reiterate what the COT is and what it's not. And I'll actually let Pat help you. Your slide is exactly what the COT is. It is not a recipe. It is not a thou shalt. It says these are two priorities that the secretary will consider when he does the listing decision. And I cannot tell you how many times I've gone, I just went to one a couple weeks ago with service employees that were acting as if the COT was grandma's recipes. It is not. And so don't get out there to where you start acting like it's something that it isn't. You want to add anything?
I think the secretary chief will decide.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right.
He will make a recommendation.
It's a destination, it's not the path to get there.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So what we did is we went through core area by core area, and I know this is a lot of data, and I'll just summarize it. So we went through for energy, mining, and infrastructure. The COT identifies those as three separate. We lump them together in the DDCT, so we put them together. So what we have is that I think it's 12 out of 30 core areas do not have any DDCTs in them. There was no permitted activity that shows up in that. That was DDCT related. There might have been some de minimis things, which includes grazing or grazing related or water related. So the rest of them, so you can see there was 234 DDCTs that were energy, mining, or infrastructure related. We had 105 non-compliant DDCTs. And when you first look at that, at the surface, you say, oh, but let me tell you what took place inside those DDCTs. Out of the 105, we were due to valid and existing rights. We co-located them, put them in existing disturbance or industry voluntarily minimized the footprint. It was a huge effort. So out of that 105, there was only 26 acres that actually were non-compliant. They were added to the whole 4-area system. That's pretty good. That's pretty good. That's a lot of work by a lot of people, and they're sitting in this room and they're sitting behind desks, and I want to say thank you to them because, you know, to say 105 out of 234, you know, you kind of go, ugh. But when you actually look at it, there's only 26 non-compliant acres. That's huge. So then we also took a look at the BLM leases, and I thank Travis who worked with me on separating the data. So you can see where it says no leases. There's no leases in those core areas at all. No leases. So where do you see the minus 67%? Because of the way that the BLM is proceeding until they get to the RMP 9, where they have a stipulation that says you're not guaranteed surface occupancy unless you meet for DDCT. That's the reduction of the percent of leases inside those core areas. Okay, it's not acreage, but it's the percent leases. It's your vulnerability.
Can you go through that? Sorry.
Sure. So as leases expired, so we started out in 2012. We had a bunch of leases that were 40, 50, 60, whatever acres. As those expired and the new leases came in, if they didn't meet that criteria, that's the reduction of leases from 2012 to now. Now,
That's a percentage.
Percentage, yes, percentage, which is huge. There's 67% fewer leases inside the black sport as a result of the way that they've been looking at it. It doesn't mean they won't come up for lease again, but when they come up for lease again, they'll have that stipulation on them that says you have to comply with the DDC.
So another interpretation of that, Brian, is that, correct me if I'm wrong here, that percentage then would have a surface protection on it should they become.
That's right.
It is essentially an NSA.
Yes. If they can't comply with the
Correct.
DDC.
So the protections are there. In other words, the do no harm is cemented in that.
Yes.
And I assume we're breaking out these achievements in a report form or just supplying the data?
No, we went through and outlined that in our data column. That's why we went against the cuts. We're showing the decline has stopped. Yeah, at least from what I can tell. I mean, Gary may have some sinusoidal thing that goes in there that to say no, but I mean, this is pretty big.
That's what I'm saying.
Well, our total document was 1,700 pages. I got blessed with the Fish and Wildlife Service.
Mark, thanks you, and Pat, thanks you, sure.
No, but what we try to do is show the data, show what we see as the analysis, show what we see as the boiled down message.
Mark's on page 11 and Pat's on page 12.
So I'm going to just keep there's more COT objectives, and then these are, you know, implement targeted management, restoration, voluntary, blah, 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 monitoring. You know, are we doing good things? Are we making sure that they happen on the ground and are we tracking them along ways? So we went into the data. We also went in and divided. We wanted to understand the percentage of private surface, state surface, and federal surface by core area, and also by oil and gas mineral ownership. So what we went in, so 15 out of 31 core areas have these easements, private land easements. So let's take black sport. 37% of the core area has private surface. 95% of the private surface is covered in easements. So we have easement coverage, so when you talk about targeted, ooh, that's not bad. I worry about what's gonna happen on the surface. We're able to show that, so let's go down.
I picked two others because as the service has identified areas for quote unquote super PACs or whatever you want to call it, if you look at Fontenelle, which is one of those, over half the private lands have surface protection on it. Or if you look at Daniel, which is another one that has a huge ramifications, 41%. Those are stunning figures.
And that's why it was so important to know what is composing those core areas, because when you talk about the acreage of easements on private surface, what does it really mean? This tells you how much of it is protected. There was, out of all the easements that we received, there was only one that was returned, and all the rest of them were from. Okay, and I can't even read this. So then we also went down, so you were asking about CCA. The acres of CCA are right here by core area. This is habitat improvement. These are the acres by core area, habitat improvement. Now, I didn't have time, but it would be nice to have gotten the percentage of those core areas that were actually improved that had habitat improvement, and that could be another analysis. These were, we went back to 2000 and tracked both prescribed burn that was prior to our protocol, as well as wildfires. And these are the acres that people had found had returned back to suitable. It's either 5%, it's trending down. So like here at Grass Creek, I believe that the fire amount there was about 9,500 acres in the last 10, 12 years. And 8,900 acres had come back. A lot of that was treated, burned, but it had prescribed burn, but it has come back. So we're documenting that information as well. And you got the CCAAs, you got fence modification, and 24 miles of fence modification, and there were 44 infrastructures that were inside the core areas. Okay, cut objectives. Okay, and you don't have to read it. It just was really impressive to me, the amount of research and projects and in-depth information that has gone on. So there's over 600 projects that have or are ongoing inside Wyoming that are 60. Oh man, I grew.
So 6.
Okay, so I wanted to show you, just to delve in a little bit more into the actual data. So we also broke it down to Buffalo management zone, Buffalo River Basin, the core area, the percentage of Wyoming's core areas of Buffalo makes up 3.2%. It has 1.9% of the burns in the occupied left. We've got the surface ownership, and then we also have the land status. And here's where the leases, percent change in leases. So this is how we went through it. And I'm going to actually show and Amanda was the format queen. So we went into the cut again, we took Maureen's recommendations to heart. We said we needed to go and convert it or compare it to the cut. So we added all the threats for each core area and how they came out. Green means it's a no threat, yellow means it's a low threat, red is a high threat. We went through, we tried to, I'll take a conversion, there's no data reported, we don't think that there's anything converted, we can go across, no data reported. It's green, it's not a big deal. Annual grasses and weeds. We don't have any data to show what we lost, but we do know that we treated over 14,600 or 760 acres for annual grasses and annual. So the green areas are credits. So energy development, mining and infrastructure, yeah, that's our estimated active that's current. We've had 2 divots that added 43.08 acres. The average DDCT disturbance was 1.93. It ranged from 1.67 to 2.19. And here you got the disruptions. Those 2 DDCTs in the Daniel Core area were compliant. And we also know that we have remediation on wells related to industry. So there's 13 of those. Sorry, this is the de minimis activities. So we did have 13 water wells. It was remediation and new water wells. And were they compliant? Yes. And then here's the structures removed. And we also added Mike's data from UW, which is 2,157 acres of area. So green means the positive. That means we're moving to the right way.
Means we meet the COP.
Yes.
Then on the other side, the colors are the threat. You know, ag conversion, green means there is none.
Right.
The yellow means it's potential. The red means that it's existing. And what you want is you want anything that's red to have the green line. So we did that every threat, every core area, right, Mary?
Yes.
And went through, and then that's what feeds back into the analysis of the COT based on their red, yellow, green system. When did you came up with that? About 6 months ago, 9 months ago? First time you guys used it? The red, yellow, green analysis.
Oh, yeah. I don't know. Last year was, or that.
For this instance, yes. Yeah.
It was high. Yeah, yeah. They used HL and all.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when you get the NRCS, you're on the whole project, we predate this, value.
That is the goal, is to have a running record. I'll tell you, I don't ever want to do it the way I did it again. It was ugly. But I think we need to do it. I mean, this tells a huge story.
This isn't Kickstarter statistics we've been talking about for years. This is really a great Kickstarter.
You know, we added the CCAs, we're trying to summarize everything, core area by core area, as much as possible. I'll go down, sagebrush illumination, urbanization. You know, here's where we got our easements. We think too are NRCS, so there might be some duplication. If we thought they were NRCS, we tried to put it in there. But 41% of the private surface is covered. And there's 30 acres and 1 30-year term. So that's, we identified the 1 term right here. So, we can go down. So Douglas, same thing. So the reason this is yellow is, remember, Douglas core area is a tougher area because of the existing disturbance. We outlined everything that we've done, and then we have a management plan over it. It's in yellow because it didn't comply. It's not red, that's how it complies. We can be doing. You know, it's kind of neutral. It's kind of, we're waiting and seeing. So that is, and I think that's the end of it. But the document, we also took in all the local working groups data. We took in, you know, we don't have all that data specifically identified in the core area. We need to capture that. That's not represented completely in here either. We just ran out of time. So our goal going forward is to try to figure out how to continue to collect the data and tell the story.
Just a quick question. So this is core areas only, or this is all sage-grouse conservation measures that have been applied?
So we did threats by core area. But we also included non-core data.
Other questions?
And kind of.
In the background.
Yeah, Eric.
As everyone knows, last week Johnson sage-grouse was listed as threatened. This conversation gives me deja vu because this is exactly what the local and state governments were saying in Colorado over the course of the summer. And they had a lot of good points because, you know, there were a lot of good things that were happening. But the fundamentals were at the end of the day that when it came down to looking at what was being done against the peace policy, you had to have certainty of implementation. You had to have science-based effectiveness. They couldn't demonstrate that. So when we look at greater sage grouse today versus what was happening in 2010 when it was warranted but precluded, you know, we're not going to win the battle based on sage grouse population numbers because our sage grouse populations are low. So that means that, you know, we're not going to be able to rely on that. We're not going to be able to rely on being able to say that the habitat is increased in magnitude or capacity a great deal. So really, where the state of Wyoming has an opportunity here to make the case that listing is not necessary is that the regulatory mechanisms have been increased and that they have certainty of implementation and science-based effectiveness. There are kind of four main places where you have issues with that. You have the 0.6 mile left buffer, which isn't supported by the science. You have the DDCT, which doesn't have any scientific backing. You've got the 5% disturbance cap, which doesn't have any basis in science. And then you've got the de minimis treatment of livestock grazing, which, you know, obviously the Fish and Wildlife Service is looking at that. This is an opportunity for the state of Wyoming to bring its executive order and its core area policy up to snuff so that the case can be made. That, you know, yeah, sure, we still got those threats out there. Yeah, sure, the population is lower, but yeah, now we have these measures that are going to address those threats prospectively. And right now you're vulnerable.
Eric, I appreciate your opinion, but I'm going to push back on you. The 0.6 mile buffer is documented in science for over a decade. You have misinterpreted what it's there for. It's there to protect breeding males on last. It's been resubstantiated in the past month by research over in Carbon County, and it is very credible science. The DDCT is the only game in town. So if you want to critique it based on how it's scientific application, give me a better methodology. The other one that you mentioned, the 5%, came straight out of Noggle. It's been documented again by Kirill and others that it's probably low. It could be as much as 7 to 10%. And as far as the de minimis, there's no evidence that's been shown that grazing per se is harmful to sage grouse. So you're welcome to make statements, but next time you make them, don't think nobody's going to push back on it when they're as erroneous as the statement you just made.
Well, honestly, Bob, you know, when you look at the 0.6 mile left buffer, we've got researchers in this room that show that you have a significant negative effect on the breeding males when you have a single oil and gas well that's within 2 miles of a sage grouse lake. So, you know, I honestly can't sit here and hear you misrepresent the science in that way. And, you know, in terms of the grazing, you know, there are a lot of studies that have been done that say basically that there are levels at which grazing can be compatible, but they're not all compatible. And
that's exactly what I said.
And so we need to make sure that the Sage Grouse executive order is in line with the science in a way that's watertight. I don't think you are. You can believe you are, but you know, I think there's a ways to go yet. And here's an opportunity for the state of Wyoming to improve its chances to avoid a listing.
Well, I appreciate your opinion. Any other comments, questions?
And I'm gonna just, Mike's gonna talk about his reclamation effort. But what we did put in there is that we do have, this is just 1 acre. It was a really good acre, but 1 acre with monitoring plan and objectives and adaptive management principles. So, you know, we're trying to follow up on all the interim reclamation, all the habitat improvements. So we're trying to, Mike, we just put a summary in here. Mike's got some of that data and he's gonna have that as well. So I just.
And you can do that this afternoon.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I mean, all the efforts are just huge. I mean, just putting them together and understanding what they add up to, I mean, it's pretty enormous.
Yeah. I would just add again that breaking out these results in a really digestible manner is something that could do this committee a great deal of good, and I think do the state of Wyoming a tremendous favor in having those results easily represented. I keep thinking about the 60% reduction in conventional drilling and a 1,460% increase in directional drilling. Those have obvious implications on the ground. And being able to report those adequately and correctly and in a manner that people can absorb would be very helpful to the client.
I think what we need to do relative to that is, and we do have a meeting this week with Manny McKay, who is the public information officer for the department. I think what happens is we've got so much data, and the people who crunch data have a hard time getting that into a concise format. So I think that's kind of a training exercise, but we are working to get that put in that.
I think giving them the help to do that is one of the best things we can do.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, Mary mentioned the point that this should be kind of a running database. And I'd really like to have that conversation with you and Nick and this module, because I think that's going to be our biggest challenge going forward. How do we accept this data and treat it rapidly? And I'll explain some of that with what I'm dealing with.
Okay.
I think that's something we have a conversation about.
Okay.
Yeah, Bob, and just to take off of that, so what is going to be the procedure for continually accepting data? And this is why I think this is important. Because at the end of the day, we're probably going to have to demonstrate this data at least twice. Probably have to demonstrate it at least once to the Fish and Wildlife Service and then once to a federal judge someplace. Yeah, twice. Once to each one. Maybe twice, but 3 times, maybe 4 in the case of the left. That being said, we need to continually update this database. So what are the protocols are we doing? How often are you updating it? What's the mechanism to continue to implement the information? That we get it to you and you get it into the database. When do we see those periodic reports regenerated?
Well, this was, Ray Brothers, the first plane, it didn't crash, it didn't land. What's that?
We built it in flight.
We built it in flight. So that, we're trying to answer all those questions. And I think what we built wasn't quite right, and we're looking at what we can do to keep it better so that we can take in the Fish and Wildlife Services data and everybody else's data. So we really want to tell our story and not someone else. So I don't have an answer. I know we're trying to, but it's big though, because there's so much data. And it relies on the land, it relies on Forest Service. The conservation districts were awesome. The Department of Ag was awesome. And there's just a lot of people that had to do it. So all those people have to engage with us as well.
Well, I think Susan kind of started this all at state lands and built from there. But I think the idea is that, yeah, the first lift was incredibly heavy, but in doing that, we've also learned some things that will make it go easier. You want to comment on that? Because you guys have been at it the longest. I think you and Nancy.
Well, when we started, I worked with Mary when the database was developed. And so I learned some things then. But it is just part of our process now. Anytime an applicant or a permit has been approved by the borderline commissioners and becomes effective, that goes into the database. So everything, I mean, it's just part of our process now. Moving forward, we did go back and look at older data. Like I just put in our oil and gas lease options for 2013. But I think one of the most important things is you need to include, to make it easier on Mary, that WIR number is vitally important to them, because when they went through to sort the data, that's where a lot of the problem. You have to have that WIR number. And I strongly suggested to staff that everything that goes into the system have that WIR number. So that took us some time to go back and research and pull all the files and get the WIR number. But after we got that, I mean, it's just part of our process now. On each and every permit, we have the WIR number, because we don't issue anything until it goes through Game and Fish. And we have their comments on it. They tell us what steps we need, or if it's, we don't do a lot in core, but in non-core, if we need timing or whatever on there, it's all part of their response back to our request.
I think for those who have worked with it, the other thing is that, remember the first DDCTs and how long that took and how difficult, and now they're down to, workbook is 5 minutes, the DDC is 10, and am I right? You remember all you guys were like, oh my God, you can't, well, this will be much the same when we get it all put in. It's getting used to how we do it, and actually it works quite well. So a lot of thought went into it, and I think what's been built is a system that really will serve us well in the future. So. Okay, Paul.
Perhaps a discussion after lunch, not to cut in too much to our lunch hour, obviously. We raised this issue before about how the agencies are feeding data on proposed projects into Fish and Wildlife. I still have some great concern over how that may or may not be shaping up, any sidebars on it, et cetera. I think it's worth the discussion.
Let's just add that to Pete and Mike's presentation when we get done. We'll just kind of spread that out into a broader discussion. So Pam and those of you in the agencies that are dealing with that, be prepared to have that conversation when we do that. Does that work? Okay. All right, it's time. Yep.
My name was on the agenda, so I would be remiss if I didn't say something. Just wanted to
put that orange jacket on.
just very shortly, everything that's going in Wyoming's database is great, but you have to remember the decision is made range-wide. And so I was going to give a quick update on the CED range-wide. Things are going well. Oregon and Idaho, and Lee, jump in if I say anything wrong, are well on their way of putting things in. There are 100 projects that are in the CED that have been approved by the agency authorized personnel. There's another 100 that are waiting for approval. Just as a background, my understanding is Wyoming's going to have over 800 entries, so just see where you are on that. There's a couple states, Utah and Colorado, that have not put anything in yet. We're still waiting on Washington. We're not sure they're going to put anything in. We're not sure why, but it may have something to do with the Columbia Basin population. But just things are moving. They're moving slowly. Obviously, we're still a month away from the deadline, but our database people are working with Wyoming to do the crosswalk so that we can do both downloaded in the near future. So just let you know.
Is there an indication from Utah and Colorado that they will put stuff in, or are they? Where are they?
As of like 4 o'clock on Friday, I talked to the state of Utah. They are, but the suggestion was they have no idea if and or what they have and how much. And so there'll be discussions. I think it's that they have it. It's just spread out. And I don't want to miscategorize. It was a very brief conversation, so I don't want to miscategorize John's comments. But yeah, but I believe, with the exception of Colorado, and Colorado previously said that they were going to, but then we haven't heard much. But I believe every other state, including the Dakotas, I think everybody's just in the process of collecting, and they're just not as far along. So,
do you anticipate they'll load it as they get it, as opposed to amalgamating it and then loading? Or?
Yeah, I mean, every state I think has been. I mean, Oregon started a few months back. Idaho has started, but it's done. South Dakota said they were going to. I'm unfortunately guessing we're going to have a big mid-December. My hair's on fire, and I've got to get all my stuff into the CD.
Where's Montana in that market?
Same boat. They've started entering projects, but I think as of Friday they had 3. But it's just some states have half a dozen people working on this. Some states have 1, and then some states may have hundreds of projects to enter. Some states may have a dozen. I mean, I would guess South Dakota maybe has a dozen. I don't know. So it's just very low across the country.
Yeah.
I want to go back to the point that Dave just made here. We're fearful that everyone's going to wait until the middle of December to enter these data. And Wyoming is one of 11 states, and you guys are doing an amazing job. There's 11 states, because we have all kinds with 2 provinces, and they have all kinds of independent folks who are entering information. So anything we can do to get this information loaded before the middle of December, I think is only gonna help, because otherwise I'm fearful our system's gonna crash. And those of you familiar with the federal system know a lot of us are gone, because we have all kinds of leave to burn. So, leave anything you can do. The other thing is that for those of you who want to go rogue, be independent, we created these little cards that show you how to get onto the database, how to use the database. I'll leave these out on the desk if folks are not fun.
Yeah, and just a plea, if you will, to those of you in industry who work across state lines. Please let your counterparts and your colleagues in those other states know how important this is. This is critical information that has to be. So appreciate that. Let's take a lunch break. We'll come back promptly at 1 and start back up. Thank you.
Good. How about you?
I'll try to sneak here. I've never
I know they seem to work pretty good. Wow. Well, they're going to